taking up to or as much as a $2.6 billion write down, okay, on California assets. What about the write down? The write down's a one time impairment. It's not going to be continuous. The write down is going to be in the rearview mirror. The write down was because they're California assets. They had to divest of them because they were non-performing assets. So they're going to write it down, expense it, lower their earnings, and then they're going to take those assets, they're going to mark them down, and then they're going to sell them to somebody else who might dismantle them or actually put it back into operation. I don't know.
California's energy and business climate is facing a new stress test, and this time the numbers are difficult to ignore. When one of the world's largest energy companies reports $1.3 billion in losses tied specifically to California operations, it sends a signal far beyond a single balance sheet. It raises questions about regulatory pressure, investment viability, and how sustainable the state's economic environment has become for large employers. Recent disclosures involving ExxonMobil have intensified scrutiny around California's energy policies and their real-world consequences. These losses are not the result of a single event, but of accumulated costs tied to regulations, compliance requirements, operational constraints, and market conditions unique to the state. For policymakers, business leaders, and workers alike, the issue is no longer theoretical. Energy companies sit at the center of California's economy. Their costs affect fuel prices, supply stability, transportation expenses, and ultimately the cost of living. When losses reach into the billions, the ripple effects extend to jobs, tax revenue, and future investment decisions. This breakdown examines what led to ExxonMobil's reported losses in California, why the response from state leadership has been unusually intense, and what this moment reveals about the broader risks facing businesses operating in the state. The focus is not politics, but impact, accountability, and what comes next if current trends continue. 10. California-specific compliance costs erode profit margins. ExxonMobil's reported $1.3 billion in California-related losses did not emerge from a single operational failure. They reflect a cumulative burden created by California-specific compliance costs that do not exist in most other energy-producing states. Over time, these layered requirements quietly erode profitability, even for the world's largest energy companies. California imposes unique environmental reporting standards, emissions controls, fuel formulation rules, and permitting processes that add both direct expenses and indirect delays. Each requirement on its own may appear manageable. Combined, they significantly raise the cost of operating refineries, transporting fuel, and maintaining infrastructure within the state. These costs are largely fixed, meaning they persist regardless of market conditions. For ExxonMobil, this creates an uneven playing field. Facilities operating in California face higher baseline expenses compared to similar operations in Texas, Louisiana, or overseas. When global energy markets fluctuate, California operations have less room to absorb losses before profitability turns negative. These compliance costs also reduce operational flexibility. Adjustments that might be routine elsewhere, such as modifying output levels or upgrading equipment, often require extended regulatory review in California. Delays translate into missed market opportunities and higher overhead. This issue matters because compliance costs compound quietly. They do not trigger immediate shutdowns or headlines, but they weaken margins year after year. Over time, losses accumulate to levels that force strategic reassessment. While this pressure alone does not explain billion-dollar losses, it forms the foundation of the problem. As compliance costs squeeze margins, other vulnerabilities become more dangerous, starting with the growing constraints placed on refinery operations across the state. 9. refinery operations face. Increasing operational constraints. Beyond compliance costs, ExxonMobil's California losses are closely tied to growing operational constraints placed on refinery activity across the state. California's refineries operate under some of the most restrictive environmental and permitting frameworks in the world. While these rules aim to reduce emissions and environmental risk, they also limit how refineries can respond to changing market conditions. Refineries require flexibility to adjust output, conduct maintenance efficiently, and upgrade equipment in response to demand or price shifts. In California, even routine modifications can require lengthy approval processes, environmental reviews, and legal challenges. These delays increase downtime and reduce operational efficiency, especially when facilities are aging and require frequent maintenance. California's refineries are also more vulnerable to disruption. When one facility reduces output or shuts down temporarily, replacement supply is difficult to secure. The state's specialized fuel requirements limit imports from other regions, leaving refineries with little margin for error. As a result, operational hiccups quickly translate into financial losses. For ExxonMobil, constrained refinery operations mean higher cost per barrel and reduced ability to capitalize on favorable market conditions. While refineries in other states can ramp production or adjust blends more easily, California facilities face structural limits that suppress profitability even during strong demand periods. This issue matters because refinery constraints magnify every other financial pressure. Compliance costs raise the baseline, and operational limits prevent recovery. When these factors combine, losses escalate quickly, setting the stage for the next escalation, where fuel price volatility further destabilizes both producers and consumers across the state. 8. Fuel price volatility hits California harder than other states. California's energy market amplifies fuel price volatility in ways that significantly increase financial risk for companies like ExxonMobil. The state's unique fuel blend requirements, limited refinery network, and geographic isolation from major fuel corridors mean that even small disruptions can trigger sharp price swings. These swings create unstable operating conditions that are difficult to manage profitably. Unlike most states, California cannot easily import large volumes of gasoline from neighboring regions when supply tightens. Fuel produced elsewhere often does not meet California's environmental specifications without modification. This lack of flexibility means local refineries must absorb demand fluctuations internally. When output drops unexpectedly, prices spike quickly. When demand softens, margins compress just as fast. For energy producers, volatility creates planning challenges. Long-term contracts, capital investments, and maintenance schedules depend on predictable pricing. In California, price instability increases uncertainty and reduces confidence that investments will deliver expected returns. Even when prices rise at the pump, higher revenues do not always offset compliance costs, downtime, and operational inefficiencies. Consumers feel volatility immediately, but producers absorb hidden costs behind the scenes. Rapid price swings complicate inventory management, hedging strategies, and regulatory compliance. Losses can accumulate during periods when prices move faster than operations can adjust. This issue matters because volatility compounds existing structural weaknesses. Compliance costs and operational constraints set the foundation, but price instability accelerates losses. When volatility becomes persistent rather than episodic, it undermines long-term viability, pushing companies toward broader strategic pullbacks and reduced investment, which leads directly into the next escalation: declining capital commitment within the state. 7. energy companies scale back investment in the state. As losses mount and volatility persists, one of the clearest responses from energy companies is a gradual reduction in long-term investment within California. ExxonMobil's $1.3 billion loss signals not just a financial setback, but a reassessment of how much capital the company is willing to commit to operations that carry higher risk and lower predictability. Large-scale energy infrastructure requires decades-long planning horizons. Refineries, pipelines, and distribution systems demand continuous reinvestment to remain safe, efficient, and compliant. When regulatory uncertainty, operational constraints, and price volatility converge, projected returns become harder to justify. Companies respond by delaying upgrades, reducing expansion plans, or redirecting capital to regions with more stable operating environments. For California, this shift has long-term consequences. Deferred investment accelerates infrastructure aging, increasing maintenance costs and the likelihood of outages. Innovation slows as companies prioritize compliance over modernization. Over time, facilities become less competitive compared to newer operations elsewhere in the country. Employees and local economies feel the effects early. Capital spending supports not only refinery workers, but also contractors, engineers, suppliers, and service providers. When investment slows, job growth stalls and regional economic activity weakens, even before layoffs occur. This issue matters because investment decisions shape future capacity. Once capital flows elsewhere, reversing that trend becomes difficult. Reduced investment today limits flexibility tomorrow, tightening supply and increasing vulnerability to shocks. As capital commitments shrink, the impact moves beyond balance sheets. The next escalation emerges where reduced investment begins to threaten job security and economic stability in energy-dependent regions across California. 6. Job security weakens in energy-dependent regions. As energy companies scale back investment in California, the effects begin to reach workers and communities that depend on refinery and fuel-related operations. ExxonMobil's reported losses signal financial strain, but for employees, the concern centers on stability. Energy sector jobs are typically high-paying, skilled positions that support entire regional economies. When losses persist, job security becomes less certain. Refineries and associated facilities employ thousands of workers directly and support many more through contractors, logistics firms, maintenance crews, and local suppliers. When companies delay upgrades or reduce capital spending, overtime decreases, contract work slows, and hiring freezes become more common. These changes often occur quietly, well before any public announcements of layoffs. Energy-dependent regions feel the pressure first. Communities built around refinery operations rely on consistent employment and stable wages. As uncertainty grows, workers may delay major purchases, reduce spending, or seek employment elsewhere. This behavior feeds back into the local economy, affecting housing demand, retail activity, and municipal revenue. For companies, workforce decisions are especially sensitive in California due to regulatory complexity and labor costs. Rather than expanding payrolls, firms may consolidate roles or shift new positions to other states. Over time, this reduces California's share of industry employment without triggering a single headline event. This issue matters because employment instability spreads faster than financial losses. When workers feel uncertain, economic confidence erodes. As job security weakens, pressure builds on local governments and public services, leading directly into the next escalation, where corporate losses begin to affect state tax revenue and budget stability. 5. State tax revenue becomes more volatile. When a company the size of ExxonMobil absorbs $1.3 billion in losses tied to California, the impact does not stop at corporate balance sheets. It flows directly into state and local tax systems that rely heavily on corporate income, payroll taxes, and economic activity tied to large employers. Over time, these losses introduce volatility into public revenue streams that are already sensitive to market shifts. California's tax structure depends disproportionately on a small number of high-value contributors. Large corporations and high-income earners account for a significant share of total revenue. When major firms experience sustained losses, taxable income declines, capital spending slows, and payroll growth weakens. Even without relocation, reduced profitability translates into lower tax collections. Energy companies contribute through multiple channels. Beyond corporate income taxes, they generate fuel taxes, property taxes, and employment-related revenue. When operations contract or investment slows, each of these streams weakens simultaneously. For the state, this creates revenue gaps that are difficult to predict and harder to offset quickly. Volatility complicates budgeting. When revenues fluctuate sharply, long-term planning becomes riskier. Infrastructure projects, environmental programs, and public services face uncertainty as funding projections shift. Lawmakers are often forced to react after the fact, making mid-cycle cuts or drawing down reserves. This issue matters because fiscal instability compounds economic risk. When corporate losses reduce revenue reliability, the state's ability to respond to economic stress weakens. As budgets tighten, the pressure moves outward, affecting consumers directly through fuel availability, pricing, and supply risks, which marks the next escalation in the crisis. 4. Fuel supply risks increase for California consumers. As corporate losses mount and investment slows, the effects begin to surface in the most visible place for the public: fuel availability. California's energy system operates with limited redundancy. When companies like ExxonMobil reduce capital spending or delay upgrades due to sustained losses, the margin for error in fuel supply becomes thinner. California relies on a small number of in-state refineries to meet demand, and importing fuel from other regions is not simple. The state's specialized fuel standards restrict how easily out-of-state gasoline can be brought in during shortages. This means that when refineries face maintenance issues, outages, or reduced output, replacement supply cannot be secured quickly. For consumers, this creates heightened risk of localized shortages and sudden price spikes. Even when fuel is available, supply constraints can push prices higher with little warning. These increases are not always tied to global oil markets, which makes them feel unpredictable and difficult for households to plan around. Fuel supply risk also affects essential services. Transportation networks, emergency responders, agriculture, and delivery systems all depend on consistent access to fuel. When availability tightens, costs rise across the economy, and service reliability can suffer. Consumers experience the effects through higher prices, longer lines, or reduced access in certain regions. This issue matters because supply risk transforms corporate losses into public impact. What begins as a business problem becomes a consumer problem when fuel availability is threatened. As supply uncertainty grows, confidence declines, not just among drivers, but across industries that depend on stable energy access. That loss of confidence leads directly into the next escalation: a broader decline in business trust across California's heavy industry sectors. 3. Business confidence declines across heavy industry. When a company as large as ExxonMobil reports $1.3 billion in losses tied to California operations, the signal travels far beyond the energy sector. Heavy industries across the state, manufacturing, logistics, chemicals, construction, and infrastructure. Pay close attention to how regulatory pressure, cost volatility, and investment risk affect major operators. Over time, these signals shape confidence. Business confidence does not collapse overnight. It erodes gradually as companies reassess long-term assumptions. When losses persist in one sector, others begin questioning whether similar pressures could affect them next. For heavy industry, which relies on stable energy access, predictable regulation, and long-term capital planning, uncertainty becomes a deterrent. Companies respond cautiously. Expansion plans are delayed. New facilities are reconsidered. Capital is redirected toward maintenance rather than growth. Executives begin prioritizing flexibility over scale, favoring shorter-term commitments instead of multi-decade investments. These shifts are often invisible at first, but their cumulative effect is significant. California's industrial base has historically benefited from proximity to ports, skilled labor, and innovation ecosystems. However, when operating costs rise faster than productivity gains, those advantages lose some of their weight. Firms begin comparing California's risk profile against alternatives in other states or countries. This issue matters because confidence drives investment. When confidence declines, growth slows even without formal exits. Over time, fewer projects are approved, fewer jobs are created, and fewer risks are taken. As heavy industry hesitates, the pressure intensifies, bringing the crisis closer to its most serious phase, where long-term infrastructure itself faces the risk of downsizing or relocation. INTUs. Long-term energy infrastructure faces exit risk. As financial losses persist and confidence declines, California faces a risk that goes beyond short-term volatility, the gradual exit or downsizing of long-term energy infrastructure. ExxonMobil's $1.3 billion loss is not just a snapshot in time. It raises questions about whether maintaining large-scale energy assets in the state remains viable over the long run. Energy infrastructure is capital-intensive and immobile. Refineries, pipelines, and distribution networks require decades of investment and predictable operating conditions to justify continued maintenance and upgrades. When regulatory pressure, cost volatility, and constrained returns converge, companies begin reassessing where future capital should be deployed. Exit risk does not always mean immediate shutdowns. More often, it appears as a slow retreat. Planned upgrades are cancelled. Aging facilities are maintained at minimum levels rather than modernized. New capacity is built elsewhere. Over time, the state's energy system becomes older, less flexible, and more vulnerable to disruption. For California, this carries significant consequences. Reduced infrastructure investment limits the ability to meet demand reliably, especially during peak periods or emergencies. Supply chains become more fragile. Dependence on external fuel sources increases, even as importing fuel remains difficult due to regulatory requirements. This issue matters because infrastructure decisions are difficult to reverse. Once facilities are downsized or decommissioned, rebuilding capacity takes years, if not decades. The loss of infrastructure also affects employment, tax revenue, and energy security simultaneously. As the risk of infrastructure exit grows, California approaches the final and most severe stage of the crisis, where regulatory ambition collides directly with the realities of energy markets and economic sustainability. 1. California's regulatory model collides with energy market reality. The most serious consequence of ExxonMobil's $1.3 billion California losses is not the financial hit itself, but what it reveals about a growing collision between California's regulatory model and the realities of modern energy markets. At this stage, the issue is no longer isolated to one company or one sector. it becomes structural. California has pursued some of the most ambitious environmental and regulatory goals in the world. These policies aim to reduce emissions, reshape energy use, and accelerate long-term transitions. However, when implementation collides with operational constraints, capital requirements, and global market dynamics, unintended consequences emerge. Energy markets operate on scale, predictability, and long investment horizons. When regulatory complexity increases faster than adaptability, even the largest companies struggle to align compliance with profitability. Losses become persistent rather than cyclical. Investment shifts elsewhere. Infrastructure ages. Supply flexibility erodes. For consumers, this collision translates into higher prices, volatility, and vulnerability to disruptions. For workers, it creates uncertainty around long-term employment. For the state, it introduces fiscal instability as revenue sources weaken and costs rise simultaneously. What makes this stage most severe is its cumulative nature. Compliance costs, operational constraints, volatility, investment pullback, job insecurity, and supply risk converge at once. Each issue reinforces the others. The system becomes less resilient over time. This moment forces a fundamental question. Can California maintain its regulatory ambitions while sustaining the infrastructure required to support its economy? The answer will shape energy availability, cost of living, and business confidence for years to come. At this level, adjustment is no longer optional. It becomes necessary for stability. ExxonMobil's $1.3 billion loss in California is not an isolated corporate setback. It reflects a broader pattern where regulatory pressure, operational constraints, and market volatility are converging at the same time. As costs rise and investment slows, the effects move outward, from companies to workers, consumers, and state finances. What begins as a business challenge becomes a systemic risk when infrastructure, employment, and supply reliability are all affected simultaneously. California now faces a critical balancing act. Maintaining long-term policy goals while preserving economic stability will determine whether these pressures intensify or whether adjustment restores confidence before deeper consequences take hold.